If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. The 705th year since the foundation of Rome, the 49th year before the birth of Christ. The sun had long set behind the Apennine Mountains. Lined up in full marching order, soldiers from the 13th Legion stood massed in the dark. Bitter the night may have been, but they were well used to extremes. For 8 years they had been following the governor of Gaul on campaign after bloody campaign, through snow, through summer heat to the margins of the world. And now returned from the barbarous wilds of the north, they found themselves poised on a very different frontier. Just ahead of them flowed a narrow stream. The name of that narrow stream was the Rubicon. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a publisher and a historian. And I have to say that there isn't a day that passes when I don't think about the Romans in one form or another. It's absolutely true. It's also why that Monty Python skit was so good. Do you remember it? What have the Romans ever done for us? So just in case you don't know it or you can't remember it, Reg actually asks the rhetorical question, what have the Romans ever done for us? Expecting everyone to agree that the Romans had done absolutely nothing beneficial at all. However, one by one, the other members of the group start listing numerous positive contributions from Roman rule, including things like aqueducts, sanitation, roads, irrigation, medicine, public baths, public order, wine, peace, Pax Romana, all of those kind of things. And all of them came from Rome. So the first question that I had when I started this research was, did Julius Caesar actually cross the Rubicon on the 10th of January? And as with everything in ancient history, it's very complex. And you have to keep in mind that Caesar ruled Gaul for 8 long years with an iron fist. And he reportedly slaughtered over 1 million people in the process and took another 1 million people prisoner. I mean, look, it may have been a couple of days later, and it's further complicated by the incredible difficulty of mapping the Republican era dates into our complex contemporary calendar. And it's complicated because there were so many changes to that calendar over the millennia. The Roman calendar officially changed to the contemporary calendar, the Gregorian calendar, in 1582 under Pope Gregory XIII. And here's a very quick breakdown of how that actually occurred. So the Julian calendar was reformed by Julius Caesar in 45 BC. And it introduced a 365-day year with a leap year every 4 years, which was more accurate, way more accurate than the earlier Roman calendar. So by the 16th century, the Julian calendar had kind of drifted out of alignment with the solar year, largely due to its slightly inaccurate leap year system. To fix this, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar. And this new calendar adjusted the leap year rule and removed 10 days to realign with the solar year. And the Gregorian calendar is the calendar that we now use today. But, and there's always a but, the change wasn't immediate worldwide. So Catholic countries such as Spain and Italy and France, they adopted the new calendar in 1582, the year that he introduced it. But Protestant countries, Orthodox countries, took longer. For example, Great Britain and its colonies didn't adopt it until 1752, some 200 years later. And Russia then didn't adopt it until after the revolution in 1918. So you can understand why the date of crossing the Rubicon is a little bit hazy. So, the Rubicon. Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and I think it is one of the greatest moments in world history. It's the moment of incredible drama. And the measure of that really, I think, ever since the 17th century, maybe even the 16th century, in English, the phrase to cross the Rubicon has been used and means to take an irreversible decision. Some 2,000 years later, we still use that phrase. And that is a testament to how powerful Caesar actually was. And I think the reason that it actually has resonance is that Caesar, standing on the Rubicon, is facing what the Romans called the screaming. It's a moment of excruciating tension that is also kind of a dividing line in his career, because what he essentially has to decide is, does he stand down his command as he's been ordered to? He's been the governor of Gaul for 8 years. And does he have to lay down his command and actually go back to Rome, where he risks persecution, potentially the ruin of his career? Or does he actually stay at the head of his legions, 4 of them, some 25,000 battle-hardened, loyal men, and cross the Rubicon, which is the river that marks the boundary between his provinces in Gaul and Italy itself? And for him to cross that river, let alone at the head of his legions, is essentially to declare civil war. So before we get into that decision, let me set the scene for you very, very broadly. We're in the Roman Republic. It's the 1st century BC. So Rome at this stage isn't yet an empire in name, but it is an empire in fact. It's actually acquired all this territory in Asia and North Africa and so on. And Rome is this extraordinary city, kind of smoky brick, crowded, slum-infested, sprawling city of 1 million people. And it's risen through military might to actually become the master of the Mediterranean at this moment in time. And what it's doing is it's sending out generals in the 1st century BC, it's sending out generals to the provinces and to the frontiers who are commanding these armies, who are increasingly unwilling to basically obey the conventions of the political elite. That's essentially the picture of Rome at this stage. And you have to keep in mind, the essence of the republican system in Rome, it's founded, again, a bit like the American Republic, it's founded with the expulsion of a monarchy. And the name republic in the Roman context comes from the Latin term res publica, which literally translates to the public affair or the public matter. The term actually reflects the Roman political system that was, in theory, based on public representation and the shared governance of Roman citizens. Effectively, every male citizen has a stake in the affairs of the running of the city. And the ideal essentially is that the republic should give free rein to the talents of its people, and above all, their yearning for individual honor. But those yearning for individual honor should be subordinated to the honor of the city itself and the Roman people as a collective. And so therefore, there's a kind of ferocious series of constitutional checks and balances that are designed to stop a citizen from becoming overmighty, from making himself the equivalent of a king. Remember, that's what they hate. So those who would actually include the division of the king's powers, for instance, between the elected officials called consuls, and there are 2 of them, so that one can always keep an eye on the other, and they only serve 2 years. This is mandated. This is also true of most of the lesser magistracies in the Republic as well. But it's also something that every individual citizen is raised up with the consciousness that the king is a dirty word, that Rex is a dirty word, and that properly your personal honor must be tied up with the honor of the collective. And this is a brilliantly effective system that actually enables Rome and the Romans to have emerged from, mere cattle rustlers camped out in the hills above the marshes to actually ruling the entirety of the Mediterranean and in time, the world. The problem with this is the more powerful that Rome becomes, the more opportunities there are for its individual citizens themselves to become incredibly powerful. And you end up in a situation where certain citizens at the absolute top of the tree of achievement are able to put the whole republic in their shadow. So one of the reasons that I'm doing this podcast is because I've received numerous emails and messages from listeners who've sent me questions about Rome and the Republic. And one of those questions was, what's so special about the Rubicon? So in 49 BC, Caesar takes his troops across the Rubicon. Why is that? Because you know what? He's actually not the first over mighty individual, is he? Because Rome had already had a civil war between two massive titanic Roman figures, a generation earlier, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And Sulla had actually marched on Rome, hadn't he? So why is Caesar different? And it's a really good question. So Roman history in the 1st century BC is kind of structured around the personal rivalry of incredibly charismatic populace and people who tend to identify themselves with the traditions. And of course, the last of these populists in Roman history is Mark Antony, who fights Octavian, who eventually becomes the Emperor Augustus, one of the greatest emperors that Rome has ever seen. But of course, you've got Julius Caesar, who's an absolute classic populist against Pompey, who's also a populist, but ends up fighting on behalf of the senatorial elite. And then, of course, right at the beginning, you have these incredible figures that I just mentioned, Marius and Sulla. And Marius is a populist. He's a great general. He's not aristocratic. And one of the key things that he does is he faces up to the fact that the traditional days where, hang on, so a legion, let me just go back a little bit. So what does legion mean? Legion is basically a levy. And the idea is that a legio, a levy, is simply the Roman people in arms, effectively. And of course, everyone has heard of centurions. Well, centurions command centuries, but centuries are also the voting blocks within the republic itself. So there is this idea that the army camp is simply a mirror of the forum. The campus marches, the plain of Mars. You march out there and you can get enrolled in the army, and then you have to fight, and then you come back, and then you resume civilian life. And this for centuries has been the way that it should all be about in Rome. The problem is, again, that Rome has become too powerful. And now, if you're being enrolled in a legion, you're actually being sent to serve in Spain, or to serve in Syria, or Gaul, or Great Britain. And so it's actually impractical to imagine that you can just be sent back to Rome. So rather than having a single legio, a single levy, you start to get multiple levies, multiple legions. And Marius basically professionalizes this. And he says that it's unfair to expect peasants to go off and to be not to be paid for this service. And this idea of a citizen militia, which is what the legio has been, becomes what we now think of as Roman legions. And these become professional entities. And this makes Marius incredibly popular. And he becomes a consul a record number of times. But of course, this then generates opposition and envy. And the most charismatic figure who is envious of him is this guy called Sulla, who is a kind of a louche. He hadn't had a meteoric rise in his early days. He kind of hung out with drag queens and pimps, in the red light district, which the Roman population actually loves, by the way. He's a kind of a Trump-like figure. He's a sleazy guy, but there's a certain part of that population that actually loves him. Well, it turns out, unlike Trump, Sulla is actually a brilliantly successful general, and in due course, an absolutely ruthless political operator. And as these two guys start to come to power, there's a war looming in the east that promises all sorts of amazing riches. And it's going to be easy pickings because the legions are so well trained. And Sulla gets command of that. Then there are complicated political shenanigans going on in Rome, which means that he then gets stripped of that command. And Sulla actually has his legions ready to go to the east. And rather than accept this decision, he marches on Rome, and as you do, and Marius is forced to flee. And I know what you're thinking. If Sulla marches on Rome, isn't that a crossing the Rubicon type moment? Well, it absolutely is. You're right. But why doesn't anybody care about that? Well, they did care massively. It was an absolutely seismic event, a completely seismic event, and it was absolutely felt at the time that that's what it was. So Sulla then decides to go off to the east, and he wins the war. Meanwhile, in Rome, there's not just been a civil war, but a war with the Italian states rebelling against Rome and the Romans. And Sulla comes back, and he crushes the Italians. He then crushes his opponents in the Civil War. He establishes himself as the absolute master of Rome, and he dusts down this antique office, which is a very, very ancient one in the Republic. And of course, when the Republic is in absolutely dire straits, there's a law that says you can appoint a single man for a 6-month term, and the name of this office is dictator. And this is where we get the term for dictator. So Sulla is appointed dictator for more than 6 months because effectively he has the army at his back, and he is absolutely ruthless towards his opponents. He has a whole bunch of them massacred right in the heart of Rome in the middle of the night. He then puts bounties on people's heads and encourages people to bring him the heads of his enemies. I mean, it's an absolute rule of terror. And he uses his position of power essentially to enshrine the senatorial elite back in their kind of traditional role as arbiters of the states. And keep in mind, the senators at this stage are effectively an assembly of old men, the elders, the betters. The boni, they call themselves, the good guys. And this is how they see themselves. And the people that he's targeting the populace. And so that's why there are populares. And I think populist would be a legitimate way to actually describe them. The difference between them isn't so much about policy as it would be today, but it's more about style. And one of these populists, and he's very, very young at this point in time, is Julius Caesar. And he flees into exile. And for Caesar, that experience of having to hide out in the barns, of being hunted across Italy, of knowing that there are people who will be paid if they can get your head, stays with him all his life. And that then led me to wondering why he particularly was a target for Sulla. Well, he's related by marriage to Marius's family. So he's very much on the Marian side, and he's very much on the populist side. And he identifies with Marius's side in this terrible schism. However, he survives it. Sulla and Caesar, interestingly, will express astonishment of this later in his career. Sulla eventually lays down his powers, and as rich as he is, he retires to the Bay of Naples. But he's basically recalibrated the Republic during this time, the functioning, the plumbing of the Republic, so that basically his guys, his class of person, will be in power for decades to come. Caesar is then allowed to come back to Rome to resume his career. But I actually think what Sulla's done has had an incredible impact. The impact that it has on Caesar is that he's offended, I think, as an enthusiast for the Republican ideal of citizenship, that anyone could have done what Sulla did. He's appalled by it. So right the way through Caesar's career, he's actually going to become renowned for his clementia, for his clemency, his mercy. And there's something aristocratic about that. It's actually very humiliating for a Roman to be shown clemency by another Roman citizen. But there's another way of seeing that, and I think it's an expression of Caesar's feeling where he thinks that there should be some kind of civic commonality. And to offend against that ultimately is to offend against the deepest ideals of the Roman Republic. So I think he thinks that politics actually has limits, basically. Caesar is a very complex figure, but I think that you could say that through his career, he's motivated effectively by two great ideals. One is that his own genius should have free reign, absolutely have free reign, and that's actually a crucial part of it. He absolutely feels that no limits should be set on his ability to achieve great things, both for himself, but also for Rome. But he does have an incredibly strong sense of loyalty towards those of his fellow citizens who actually back him. And that, in due course, is why he will become a great military leader and why he will win the love of his soldiers. And on that note, we're going to go to a commercial break from our sponsor. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altidomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altidomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.permanentresidence.com. penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Now, before we get back to Julius Caesar, let me just paint a little bit of a more of the sort of surrounding picture. Sulla retires the richest man in Rome, and then Rome doesn't slip fully into dictatorship. They basically go back to the old system. I mean, it's a weakened system, but they carry on as though Sulla had never happened. And the big new kid on the block at this stage is Pompey, who's this sort of, I don't know, he's baby-faced, but he's actually nicknamed the Teenage Butcher. And of course, he'd been one of Sulla's hitmen. And he's also a kind of a local bigwig, even as young as he is, in eastern Italy. And he raises a private army, as does another big hitter called Crassus. And Pompey and Crassus both have meteoric careers in the wake of Sulla. They are Sulla's boys. They've learned from Sulla. And basically, Sulla has weighted it so that the people who backed him are now in pole position to win advancement. You know, most of them do it in the very traditional way, you know, going up through the magistries. Crassus does it by becoming incredibly wealthy. One of the underhand things that he does is he actually owns Rome's only fire service. And what he does is he waits for buildings to be on fire or even sets them on fire himself and then charges a lot of money from the owner of that building to put the fire out. And if you can't afford to pay him to put the fire out, he then buys up the land once the buildings have burnt down and starts building blocks of apartments. So, you know, slum landlord kind of thing. So he's a very nasty character. Crassus is a very controlled, very ruthless, and very intelligent figure. Pompey, on the other hand, actually models himself on Alexander the Great. You know, he even has this quiff of Alexander the Great, and he likes having very fit bodies around him at all times. And he actually ends up sourcing what he claims is the original cloak of Alexander the Great. Which is obviously, you know, some guy in an Eastern bazaar has flogged it to him, telling him that it was Alexander the Great's cloak, but of course it's not. And Alexander the Great is also a very ambivalent figure in Rome because he was a king and a conqueror, and he's actually seen by Romans as being a bit of a tyrant. So Pompey's identification with him isn't entirely positive, and it's reflective of the fact that And I think it's reflective of the fact that there were actually very kind of strict age thresholds in the Roman Republic for when you can actually hold a magistracy. So most of the Romans absolutely adore middle age because as soon as you turn 40, you could become a consul. So it's great. And, you know, the funny thing is, you know, when we hit 40, you know, we go and buy a motorbike and life looks like it's almost ended. The Romans don't think that. They go, brilliant. Now I can run for consul, which is why if you look at the portrait busts of Romans from the Republican era, they're all older. They're all older men. Pompey ignores that completely, and he just kind of gets as many commands as he possibly can. And he ends up through a complicated process kind of being command of basically the whole of the East. And the East is an absolute mess. You know, the Romans actually haven't wanted to run it. Equally, they haven't wanted any of the local kings or rulers to have any position of authority in it. So Pompey actually comes in with as a very low bar when everything there has basically collapsed into anarchy. So Pompey goes over there and he conquers the entire lot. And when he comes back to Rome, he brings local kings in his wake, and he's stupefyingly rich. He has this incredible triumph, and the event symbolized both the military and political supremacy of Rome to the Roman people. Anyway, he has this amazing triumph, and they carry an enormous bust of him, complete with quiff, entirely modeled out of pearls. And it's kind of borne aloft so that everyone can see it. And it's magnificent. It's absolutely stunning. You know, he's the hero of the hour. And it really exemplifies gloriously to the reputation of Rome. But it's also deeply, deeply offensive to people who see themselves as his peers. And one person who really detests it is Crassus, who has always been Pompey's great rival. So between them, they actually suppressed the rebellion of Spartacus, the great slave revolt. And actually, it was Crassus who did it, but Pompey actually turns up and steals the glory. So Pompey finds to his fury and disappointment, even though he's by far the richest man in Rome, people who he views as kind of worthless political schemers are getting together and they're frustrating everything that he wants to do. And basically, what he wants to do, which is quite a magnanimous thing, he wants to provide land for his veterans and he wants his settlement of the East to be ratified. And his enemies in the Senate absolutely refuse to do this. And this is classically how the Republic has functioned. Effectively, if you are high achieving, then your enemies will gang up and form a consortium and block you out. So Pompey is in a mess. And so he looks around for allies and he comes up with two. One of them is astonishing. It's Crassus, his archenemy. But Crassus basically decides that the pleasure of hating Pompey has to come second, really, to his own ambition. And Crassus has always put his ambition first. And basically, what Crassus and Pompey are both going to do is essentially a kind of a criminal operation to force through the measures that they both want, but that can only be done in a criminal way. And to do that, they need a third person. They need a consul who is ambitious, but green enough for their plan, who will force through measures, and a consul who will secretly act as their agent. And their choice for that secretive consul is Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar to date, compared to Crassus and Pompey, has had a much less successful career. He again has gone through the hoops. He's gone up the steps. There's actually a famous story that Caesar is in Spain and goes to a temple and sees a statue of Alexander the Great, and he weeps because Alexander has conquered the world and Caesar has done nothing. So Caesar is very, very ambitious, and he's also very, very able. He's incredibly popular, and he spends enormous amounts of money that he doesn't have on basically making himself popular. And he's actually the first person to stage gladiators dressed entirely in silver armor, just as a for instance, and the crowd absolutely love it. He's kind of a political showman, but he's not a joke either. No. He's a crowd pleaser for sure, but he's very dangerous, primarily because he's so smart. So Sulla has studied him, and he was openly saying to other members of the Republic, there's a lot of Moraeus in that young man. So people knew that Caesar was dangerous, and Sulla actually describes him at one stage as loosely belted. And actually, Caesar himself describes himself as loosely belted. So Caesar wears his toga in a fashionably loose belted way, and he's classed as a dandy. He's a showman. He borrows enormous amounts of money to build a villa. And then as the villa is completed, he says that he doesn't like it and he has the villa pulled down. He does all of this for showmanship. And this is the kind of stunt that actually appeals to a lot of the senators, but equally, it kind of appeals to a lot of voters as well. Roman politics had this role that senators played where the great and the good win popularity with the crowd by doing incredibly extravagant things. And that's what Caesar is doing from the start. Caesar was a showman, and I actually did a podcast earlier in the year titled, Is Caesar Trump or Nixon? And you should listen to that if you want to go into this in a little bit more detail. But don't doubt Caesar is also a great general. Caesar is incredibly brave. He actually fights with his men, and his men loved that he actually put himself on the front line when they're heading into battle. And he will turn out, as I mentioned, to be one of the greatest generals of all times. He's a man of incredible ability, but he does have a talent for grabbing attention, for winning the popular vote. And when he runs for consul for the first time, he wins it by a massive majority. And his colleague, his co-consul, is a man called Bibulus, who is there to stand up for the interests of the boni, the Senate, the classic elite. But Caesar effectively just elbows him aside. And because Caesar has elbowed him aside, the people hate him. And as he's walking through the streets, for instance, they throw buckets of shit over him as he walks through Rome. And when Caesar is pushing Pompey and Crassus's measures through, anyone who opposes him gets beaten up as they walk home, or when they're shopping in the market, when they least expect it, and they then get forced out of the forum. And of course, people then start to say that this is a consulship not of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. I mean, effectively, there are two of them, but Caesar is running the show alone, and of course being paid for by Crassus and Pompey. So then I wondered, did Caesar see himself as another Sulla with an eye, on the supreme prize, as a man who's going to wield supreme power? Or is he an opportunist, seizing chances as they come up? And I think there are two things going on in Caesar's mind. I think one is, as I said, he wants to do great things, and he wants to do great things for the Republic and for Rome. And he is frankly frustrated by the little guys who are trying to block him from doing that. And he also has a consciousness of his own genius, and he wants the opportunity to fulfill that. I think also Caesar has actually looked at Pompey and has seen that basically, if you get a command, the opportunities that open up to you will ultimately enable you to put the Republic in your shadow. Pompey is on a scale beyond anyone else at this time. I mean, Pompey is criminal in his methods, absolutely, but he's conformist in his ambitions. So then the question is, why did Pompey never do the equivalent of crossing the Rubicon when he was at the height of his powers? And the reason I think why he didn't do that was because ultimately he was in his heart a conservative. He had trampled down convention to get to the top, but then having got to the top, what he really wanted was the approval of the senatorial elite. Pompey wanted to be accepted by them, and he wasn't. Caesar actually didn't care about any of that. In fact, Caesar claimed a line of descent from the goddess Venus. He can actually trace his ancestry all the way back beyond the beginning of Rome to Troy itself. So Caesar had no hang-ups about that. He didn't care. And he wanted that license because he felt that he deserved it, but also because he felt that if he was going to be a great man in the Republic, it was no longer enough just to be consul. You had to have a record of military success behind you, which would bring you the legions who would then be devoted to you. It would bring you the wealth that you could then spend on winning yourself popularity by kind of building spectacular architectural projects in Rome, or handing money out to the poor, or staging entertainments, gladiatorial games. And the only way to do that is for Caesar to get a command. Now, one of the things that his enemies had done before he had become consul was to say that every consul, when he finishes his 2-year term of office, gets a posting. And they can basically choose where they want to go. And what they do is they say to Caesar, well, his posting can be to, organize stuff in Italy. He can be, the head of like the motorways agency, or something like that. But Caesar basically says, oh no, I'm not having any of that. So Caesar looks north, where there are various kinds of provinces on the Italian side of the Alps, and on the other side, which is Gaul, which is modern-day France. And what he turns around and says to them is, I'll have those, please. And they can't refuse him. So he gets given those, and not just for 1 year, but for 5 years. And by getting that, he's in pole position to win himself the kind of power and authority and wealth and status that only Pompey has. So his career is going from strength to strength. And the great dramas and crises, the great showdown with Pompey, lies ahead of him. The stage is set, if you will, but we're not quite at the Rubicon, but we are inching closer. And if you tune into my next episode, which I'll try and release this weekend, you'll find out what happens next. What happens when Caesar crosses the Rubicon. And I can tell you now, and this is giving me goosebumps, it will have you on the edge of your seat listening to it. I guarantee it. So folks, thanks for tuning in. Please tune in for episode 2. Have a great weekend and a week ahead, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye for now.